Her breath came in panicked gasps as she leaned close to his ear, her voice barely a whisper. "The pervert won't stop touching me. Please don't let him take me." The ballroom froze. Crystal glasses hung suspended mid-toast. Every conversation died. But the man she had chosen to beg wasn't just anyone. He was Don Marco Valenti, the most dangerous crime lord in the city. And what he did next would send shockwaves through the entire underworld. Stay with me until the end because this story will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, show some love to Mafia Moonlight Tailies. Hit that like button, subscribe for more untold Mafia stories, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and share this with someone who loves a good plot twist. Now, let's get into it. It's a warm Saturday evening at the Valenti estate, present day. The annual private gala glittered with the kind of wealth and power that most people only see in movies. Champagne flowed like water. Designer gowns swept across marble floors. And beneath the surface of polite smiles and cultured laughter, deals worth millions were being sealed with nothing more than a handshake and a nod. This wasn't just any party. This was Don Marco Valenti's territory. Every server knew to keep their eyes down and their ears closed. Every guest understood the invisible rules. You showed respect. You minded your business. And you never, ever disrupted the careful balance of power that kept this world spinning. Don Marco Valenti stood near the grand staircase, a commanding figure whose mere presence seemed to shift the energy of any room he entered. At 42, he had built an empire that stretched across the eastern seaboard. His sharp gaze missed nothing. His word carried the weight of absolute law. And tonight, like every year, he was hosting the gathering that determined who rose and who fell in his carefully controlled domain. The evening moved in smooth, orchestrated rhythm. Conversations flowed in hushed, measured tones. Alliances were strengthened. Potential threats were assessed with surgical precision. This was how Marco operated. Methodical, calculated, emotion locked away where it couldn't become a liability. He had survived in this brutal world longer than most because he lived by one unshakable truth. Sentiment was weakness, and weakness got you buried. But then something happened that would crack the iron walls Marco had spent decades building around his heart. A young woman in a maid's uniform moved through the crowd with urgent, trembling steps. Her name was Isabella Cruz, and she had been working at the Valenti estate for 8 months. Her uniform was crisp and proper, but her face was pale with terror. Her hands shook as she clutched her serving tray. Her dark eyes darted around the ballroom desperately, searching for someone, anyone who could help her. The other staff members noticed, but looked away. They had learned long ago not to get involved in matters above their station. The guests barely registered her presence at all to them. She was just part of the scenery, invisible in the way that servants always are to the powerful. But Isabella wasn't looking for sympathy from the staff or acknowledgement from the guests. She was looking for protection, and her desperate gaze landed on Don Marco Valenti's table, finding the one man in that entire ballroom who held the power to actually stop what was happening to her. Maybe it was the way every other man in the room deferred to him with subtle nods. Maybe it was the expensive tailored suit or the gold signet ring that caught the chandelier light. Or maybe it was something deeper, a woman's instinct recognizing the apex predator who could either destroy her or save her. Without thinking about protocol or consequences, Isabella abandoned her post and walked straight toward him. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Marco's security details stiffened, hands moving subtly toward concealed weapons. This was unthinkable. No one approached Don Marco Valenti uninvited, especially not a lowly maid in the middle of his most important event of the year. But before anyone could intercept her, Isabella reached Marco's side. Her fingers gripped his sleeve with desperate strength, and she leaned in close, closer than anyone outside his inner circle would ever dare. And then she whispered those words that would shatter everything Marco thought he knew about himself. "The pervert won't stop touching me. Please, don't let him take me." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the distant sound of music from the orchestra, but every nearby conversation had ceased. Every eye within range turned toward Marco, waiting to see how the notorious crime boss would handle this catastrophic breach of etiquette. His reputation was built on being untouchable, unemotional, a man who crushed problems without hesitation. Marco looked down at Isabella, still clutching his arm. Her face was turned up toward his, those wide brown eyes filled with raw terror and desperate hope. In that moment, something shifted deep in the hardened criminal's chest, something he had buried so long ago he thought it was dead. You see, Don Marco Valenti hadn't always been the cold, calculating mafia boss that the underworld feared. Once upon a time, decades ago, he had been a different man, a man who knew exactly what it cost to fail someone who needed protection. The Valenti Estate Gala wasn't just a party. It was a carefully choreographed display of power, where every detail served a purpose and every guest played their assigned role in Marco's intricate web of control. The estate itself sprawled across 15 acres of manicured grounds on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind iron gates and security that rivaled government installations. Inside the main ballroom, Venetian chandeliers cast golden light across walls adorned with priceless art, some acquired legally, most not. The marble floors gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the carefully curated elegance that Marco used as both shield and weapon. Tonight, over 200 guests moved through the space in a delicate dance of hierarchy. At the top were Marco's most trusted lieutenants, men who had proven their loyalty through blood and silence. They stood in clusters near the bar, discussing territory expansions and revenue streams in voices barely above a whisper. Below them came the business associates, legitimate entrepreneurs who needed Marco's protection and influence to keep their empires running smoothly. They laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny and paid compliments that dripped with desperation. And then there were the untouchables, men like Victor Hale. Hale represented a different breed entirely. He wasn't part of Marco's organization, but his tech empire and political connections made him valuable. Too valuable to alienate, or so the conventional wisdom went. He moved through the party with the entitled swagger of someone who believed his wealth made him immune to consequences. His eyes lingered too long on the female staff. His hands found excuses to touch shoulders, arms, lower backs. And everyone noticed, but no one said a word. This was the unspoken understanding that governed Marco's world. You could be ruthless in business. You could eliminate rivals without mercy. But you followed the rules of the estate. You respected the hierarchy. You never created chaos where Marco demanded order. For 15 years, this system had functioned like clockwork. Marco had built something more sophisticated than his predecessors ever managed, a criminal empire that operated with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. No unnecessary violence, no messy public spectacles. Everything handled quietly, professionally, permanently. His guests understood this implicitly. They saw the security positioned at every entrance, the cameras hidden in the crown molding, the armed men in tailored suits who blended seamlessly with the waitstaff. They knew that Marco's hospitality came with expectations. You enjoyed his champagne and his protection, and in return, you never, ever challenged his authority under his own roof. The evening had been proceeding exactly as Marco planned. Deals were being finalized with handshakes. Alliances were being strengthened over expensive wine. His empire was expanding precisely according to schedule. Everything was under control. Until Isabella Cruz grabbed his sleeve and shattered the illusion that Marco Valenti's perfectly ordered world was anything more than a fragile construct waiting for the right moment to crack. 3 weeks before that desperate whisper in the ballroom, Isabella Cruz had believed she was lucky to work at the Valenti estate. The pay was better than anything she could find elsewhere. The work was straightforward: serve drinks, clear plates, stay invisible. And unlike the restaurants and hotels where she'd worked before, the Valenti staff were treated with a certain baseline respect. Don Marco didn't tolerate guests who berated the help or threw tantrums over minor mistakes. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it was something. Then Victor Hale noticed her. It started small. A comment about her smile as she poured his wine. A hand that lingered too long when she handed him a napkin. Eyes that followed her across the room in a way that made her skin crawl. Isabella had dealt with men like this before. She'd learned to deflect with polite distance, to move quickly, to never be alone in a room with them. But Hale was different. He was patient, calculating. He seemed to enjoy the hunt as much as the conquest. The second week, he cornered her in the service hallway outside the kitchen. The narrow corridor was lined with storage closets and staff-only doors, far from the elegant spaces where guests were supposed to remain. Isabella had been carrying a tray of empty glasses when she felt his presence behind her. "You've been avoiding me," Hale said, his voice pleasant but his body blocking her path forward. "That's not very friendly." Isabella kept her eyes down, her heart hammering. "Excuse me, sir, I need to get back to work." His hand caught her wrist, not hard enough to bruise but firm enough to make his point. "I asked you a question." She pulled away, mumbling an apology, and hurried past him. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the tray. But when she told the head housekeeper what happened, the older woman's face had gone carefully blank. "Mr. Hale is an important associate of Don Marco's," she said quietly. "Very important. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Isabella understood perfectly. She was replaceable. Hale was not. By the third week, Hale had grown bolder. He found excuses to request her specifically when he visited. His comments became more explicit. His touches migrated from hands and arms to her lower back, her hip. Once, when she was refilling his water glass, his fingers had traced the back of her thigh. Isabella started taking longer routes to avoid the hallways where he might be waiting. She volunteered for kitchen duty instead of serving. She considered quitting, but she needed this job. Her mother's medical bills were crushing her. She was 3 months behind on rent. She had nowhere to run. No one who would believe that a man like Victor Hale, wealthy, connected, untouchable, was preying on a nobody like her. Until the night of the gala, when his hand slid beneath her uniform skirt in that shadowed hallway, and something inside Isabella finally broke. The world seemed to move in slow motion as Isabella's fingers closed around the fabric of Don Marco Valenti's sleeve. She knew what she was doing. She understood the rules she was breaking. In the 8 months she'd worked at the estate, she had never spoken to Marco directly, never made eye contact for more than a fleeting second, never dared to exist as anything more than a shadow moving through his world. The staff had made it abundantly clear. You did not approach Don Marco unless summoned. You did not interrupt his conversations. You certainly did not touch him. But Victor Hale's hand had just been on her body in that darkened hallway, his breath hot against her neck as he whispered what he planned to do to her. And when she'd tried to pull away, he'd laughed, actually laughed, and told her that no one in this house would lift a finger to help her. That Marco valued their business relationship far too much to care about the complaints of a maid. So Isabella had made a choice. She would either be assaulted in silence, or she would shatter every rule and beg the one man who could stop it. Now, with her hand gripping Marco's expensive suit jacket, she felt the full weight of that decision crashing down on her. The conversations within a 15-foot radius had died instantly. Guests turned with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to morbid curiosity. One of Marco's lieutenants took a step forward, his hand moving toward his jacket, ready to remove this problem before it escalated further. But Marco raised his other hand slightly, a gesture so subtle most wouldn't have noticed it. The lieutenant froze mid-step. Isabella could feel the heat of Marco's gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look up at his face. She kept her eyes fixed on his chest, on the perfectly knotted tie and the crisp white shirt beneath his jacket. Her entire body trembled. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks threatened to spill over. "The pervert won't stop touching me," she whispered again, her voice cracking. "Please don't let him take me." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Isabella could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could feel the stares of everyone around them, could practically hear their thoughts. Who does this girl think she is? Doesn't she know what happens to people who disrespect Don Marco? Somewhere across the ballroom, crystal clinked against crystal. The orchestra continued playing, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their employer's corner. But in this small pocket of space, time had stopped entirely. Isabella waited for Marco to push her away, waited for security to drag her out, waited for her life as she knew it to end. Instead, she heard Marco's voice, low, controlled, but carrying an edge she couldn't quite identify. "Look at me." It wasn't a request, it was a command. Slowly, Isabella raised her eyes to meet his. Marco had trained himself not to feel. For 23 years, he had perfected the art of looking at suffering without flinching, of making decisions based on profit and strategy rather than conscience. It was how he'd survived when others hadn't, how he'd built an empire while his competitors ended up in prison or shallow graves. But when Isabella Cruz lifted her tear-stained face to meet his gaze, something shifted in the carefully controlled landscape of his mind. Her eyes were brown, dark and wide with terror, yes, but also with a desperate, almost childlike trust that seemed absurdly misplaced. She was looking at him like he was her last hope, like she genuinely believed that a man who had ordered executions over dinner might somehow care about her suffering. The rational part of Marco's brain was already calculating the situation. Victor Hale was worth approximately $40 million in legitimate business opportunities and another $20 million in less legitimate ventures. He had connections in the tech industry that Marco needed for his expanding money laundering operations. Losing Hale's partnership would create complications, force Marco to seek alternatives that would take months to develop. And what was this girl? A maid, replaceable, forgettable. In the grand scheme of his empire, she was nothing. But as Marco looked into those frightened eyes, he saw someone else entirely. He saw Sophia. His sister had been 19 when she died, 23 years ago, almost to the day. She'd been working as a waitress at a restaurant on the South Side, trying to put herself through nursing school while Marco was building his criminal enterprise from the ground up. He'd been too busy then, too focused on territory wars and proving himself to the older bosses who saw him as an ambitious kid playing at being a gangster. Sophia had come to him once, nervous and ashamed, and told him about the restaurant manager who kept cornering her in the walk-in freezer, who touched her when she was counting tips, who made comments about what he'd do to her if she ever worked a closing shift alone with him. Marco had brushed it off, told her to handle it herself. He'd had bigger problems. A rival crew was moving on his territory, and he was planning the hit that would eventually make his reputation. A handsy manager at a restaurant seemed trivial by comparison. 3 weeks later, Sophia was dead. The manager had raped her in the parking lot after her shift. When she fought back, he'd beaten her so badly that she'd hemorrhaged internally. Marco had found out when the police came to notify their mother. He'd killed the manager, of course, slowly, painfully, but it hadn't brought Sophia back. And now, staring at Isabella's terrified face, Marco felt the weight of that failure like it was yesterday. "Tell me his name," Marco said quietly. Marco didn't release Isabella immediately. Instead, he gently removed her trembling hand from his sleeve and gestured almost imperceptibly to one of his female staff members standing near the wall. "Take her to the East Wing office," Marco said quietly. "Get her water. She doesn't leave that room until I come for her personally." The woman nodded and moved forward to guide Isabella away. The girl looked back once, confusion and hope warring on her face, before disappearing into the crowd. Marco turned to his head of security, a granite-faced man named Paulo who had been with him for 15 years. Their conversation lasted perhaps 10 seconds, conducted in murmurs that no one else could hear. Paulo's expression never changed, but his eyes hardened with understanding. He melted back into the shadows. Then Marco did something that made several of his lieutenants exchange worried glances. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that belonged at a friendly gathering, warm and welcoming, completely at odds with the dangerous stillness that had possessed him moments before. He picked up his glass of scotch and began moving through the ballroom with the easy confidence of a man who owned not just the estate but everyone in it. He paused to shake hands, to laugh at jokes, to inquire about business ventures and family matters. To anyone watching, Don Marco Valenti had already forgotten about the maid's bizarre interruption. He found Victor Hale near the terrace doors, holding court with a small group of tech executives and venture capitalists. Hale was in the middle of a story about his latest acquisition, gesturing expansively with his wine glass. playing the role of the self-made billionaire who had earned his place among the elite. "Victor," Marco said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to seem genuine. "I've been meaning to catch you all evening." Hale turned, his expression shifting to something appropriately deferential. For all his wealth and connections, he understood who held the real power in this room. "Marco, wonderful party as always." "I have a 1947 Macallan in my private study," Marco said conversationally. "I've been saving it for the right occasion, and I think our new partnership deserves a proper celebration. Just the two of us. What do you say to a private toast?" Hale's face lit up with unmistakable pride. Being invited to Marco's private study was a signal to everyone watching, a public acknowledgement that you had arrived, that you were trusted, that you mattered. It was the kind of status symbol that men like Hale craved more than money. "I'd be honored," Hale said. "Excellent." Marco clapped him on the shoulder like they were old friends. "Give me 10 minutes to wrap up with the mayor, then meet me upstairs. 3rd floor, end of the east corridor. Paulo will show you the way." Marco walked away, still smiling. The trap was set. Victor Hale climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor feeling like he'd finally arrived. He'd been cultivating his relationship with Marco Valenti for nearly 2 years, carefully positioning himself as indispensable. His tech companies provided the digital infrastructure that made Marco's operations nearly invisible to law enforcement. His political connections opened doors that even organized crime couldn't kick down. And now, finally, he was being welcomed into the inner sanctum. The private study was exactly what Hale expected: rich mahogany paneling, leather furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate grounds. Marco stood by the bar, pouring 2 generous glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "Close the door," Marco said without turning around. Hale did, his excitement building. This was the moment where real deals were made, where handshakes became ironclad agreements worth millions. Marco handed him a glass and raised his own. "To profitable partnerships." They drank. The scotch was smooth, expensive, everything Hale had imagined it would be. "I have to say," Hale began, settling into one of the leather chairs with the ease of someone who believed he belonged there, "I've been impressed with how you run things, Marco. The efficiency, the discretion. It's inspiring, really." "I appreciate that." Marco remained standing, swirling his scotch gently. "I believe in maintaining certain standards, order, respect, especially under my own roof." Something in Marco's tone made Hale pause, but he pushed through it. "Absolutely. Standards are what separate us from the animals." "Speaking of which," Marco said casually, "there was an interesting disruption downstairs earlier. One of my staff members seemed quite distressed." Hale's stomach tightened, but he forced a laugh. "Oh, that! The girls being dramatic. You know how these women are. They smile at you, they're friendly, then suddenly they act like you've committed some crime when you respond to their signals." He took another sip of scotch, watching Marco's face for a reaction. There was none. "She's been giving me looks for weeks," Hale continued, his confidence returning. "Playing the innocent act, but trust me, she knows exactly what she's doing. Girls like that, they see successful men and they try to create situations, probably hopping for a payout or something." "Is that right?" Marco said. It wasn't a question. "Look, I understand you have to maintain appearances," Hale said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "But between you and me, we both know how the world works. She's staff, replaceable. Our business relationship is worth, what, 60 million? More. You're not going to let some nobody-made complicate things over a misunderstanding." Hale raised his glass again, grinning. "To keeping our priorities straight." Marco didn't drink. He simply looked at Hale with an expression that finally made the other man's smile falter. "Tell me something, Victor," Marco said softly. "Do you know what happens to men who misunderstand their place in my world?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victor Hale set his glass down slowly, his grin fatting. "Marco, I think there's been some kind of miscommunication." 3 weeks ago," Marco interrupted, his voice still quiet, almost conversational. "You cornered Isabella Cruz in the service hallway. You grabbed her wrist hard enough that she had bruises for 4 days. She reported it to the head housekeeper, who told her to keep her mouth shut because you were too important to upset." Hale's face went pale. "Now wait a minute. 2 weeks ago, you requested her specifically to serve at a private meeting in the garden room. You touched her hip, her thigh. You told her she had a body made for sin and asked if she knew what you could do for a girl like her if she was smart enough to be grateful." Marco took a step closer. His movements were unhurried, almost lazy, but there was something predatory in the way he closed the distance between them. "Last week, you followed her into the wine cellar. You pressed her against the wall and put your hand under her dress. She managed to get away only because another staff member interrupted you." She's lying," Hale stammered, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "And tonight," Marco continued as if Hale hadn't spoken, "approximately 20 minutes before she came to me, you cornered her in the west corridor. You put your hand beneath her skirt. You told her that no one would help her because I valued your partnership too much to care what happened to a maid. You told her she might as well stop fighting and let you do what you wanted." Marco's voice had remained perfectly level throughout this recitation, never rising above a normal speaking volume. Somehow, that made it more terrifying than any shout could have been. "How?" Hale started to ask, then stopped himself. "How do I know?" Marco finished for him. "Victor, I have cameras in every hallway of this estate. I have staff who report everything they see and hear. Did you really think I wouldn't know exactly what was happening under my own roof? If you knew, why didn't you stop me?" Hale's fear was giving way to anger, to indignation. "Why let it go on if you were so concerned?" Marco smiled, and it was the most chilling expression Hale had ever seen. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd go," Marco said softly. "I wanted to see if you actually believed that your money and your connections made you untouchable, that you could violate the sanctity of my house, terrorize someone under my protection, and face no consequences." He leaned in close enough that Hale could smell his cologne. "I wanted to know for certain that you were stupid enough to think you were more important than my word." Marco walked to his desk and pressed a button on the intercom. "Paulo, bring them in." The study door opened, and Victor Hale's world collapsed. Paulo entered first, followed by 6 men Hale recognized immediately, the tech executives and venture capitalists he'd been talking to downstairs. Behind them came 3 more figures: a federal prosecutor Hale had met at charity events, a police captain whose campaign he'd donated to, and a prominent defense attorney who represented half the city's elite. Every eye in the room was fixed on Hale, with expressions ranging from disgust to cold calculation. "Gentlemen," Marco said, gesturing to the chairs arranged in a semicircle facing Hale, "thank you for joining us. I thought you should hear this directly from Mr. Hale himself." Hale stood frozen, his mind racing through possibilities and finding no escape route. "Marco, this is unnecessary. We can discuss this privately." "Sit down, Victor." The gentle tone was gone. What replaced it left no room for argument. Hale sat. Marco remained standing, commanding the room with the same authority he'd displayed in the ballroom. "Mr. Hale has been sexually harassing and assaulting one of my staff members for 3 weeks. I have video evidence from multiple incidents. I have witness statements. And I have medical documentation of the bruises he left on her." The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening with professional interest. "Victor, these men represent your business partners, your legal counsel, and your political connections," Marco continued. "I wanted them here because I'm giving you a choice. You can face what you've done publicly: criminal charges, media coverage, the complete destruction of everything you've built, or you can face it my way." "Your way," Hale's voice came out as a croak. "You will dissolve every business connection you have with everyone in this room, effective immediately. You will sell your majority stake in Hale Technologies at a 60% loss to a buyer of my choosing. You will liquidate your real estate portfolio and donate 75% of the proceeds to organizations that support assault survivors." Marco paused, letting the weight of it sink in. You will leave this city tonight and never return. If you're seen within 100 miles of here, if you ever speak Isabella Cruz's name, if you even think about retaliating against her or anyone associated with me, the video footage of your assaults will be delivered to every major news outlet in the country, along with a complete financial audit of your companies. You're destroying my entire life, Hale whispered. No, Marco said coldly. I'm letting you keep your life. Be grateful for that mercy, because it's more than you deserve and more than you would have received from the man I used to be. He looked at Paulo. Escort Mr. Hale to collect his belongings. He has 2 hours to be gone. 2 hours after Victor Hale's black sedan disappeared through the estate gates, Marco found Isabella where he'd left her, in the East Wing office, sitting on the leather sofa with an untouched glass of water on the table beside her. She stood immediately when he entered, her body tensing with uncertainty. The terror from earlier had faded, replaced by something more complex. Gratitude, yes, but also awareness. She understood now that she had stepped into a different world entirely, one where debts were always repaid and protection came with invisible strings. Mr. Hale won't be bothering you again, Marco said simply. He won't be bothering anyone again. Isabella's eyes widened. Is he did you? He's alive, Marco clarified. And he's gone, that's all you need to know. She nodded slowly, relief flooding her features. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since he dismissed Hale's companions and sent them back to the party. Why did you help me? Marco considered her for a long moment. He could have given her a dozen different answers. He could have told her about Sophia, about the protective instinct he thought he'd buried with his sister 23 years ago. He could have explained that every empire, no matter how ruthless, needed some kind of moral foundation, or it would collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Instead, he said, because you were right to ask, and because no one has the right to make you feel unsafe in my house. Isabella's eyes glistened with tears she was clearly trying not to shed. Thank you. I don't know how I'll ever. You don't owe me anything, Marco interrupted. You work here, you do your job well, that's enough. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. The moment Isabella had grabbed his sleeve in that ballroom, she had become something more than just another employee. She had become someone under Don Marco Valenti's protection, and in this world, that meant something. When Isabella returned to work the following week, she noticed the changes immediately. The other staff members treated her differently, not with resentment exactly, but with careful respect. They understood what had happened, or at least the broad strokes of it. They knew that Marco had taken her side over a wealthy business associate, and that kind of favoritism didn't happen by accident. The guests noticed too. No one would dare touch her inappropriately now. No one would even raise their voice in her direction. She moved through the estate with an invisible shield around her, one that carried Marco's name and reputation. Isabella Cruz was no longer just a maid trying to survive in a dangerous world. She was under the Valenti shadow now, protected by the same ruthless power that made others tremble. And in the back of Marco's mind, in the place where Sophia's memory still lived, something that had been broken for 23 years felt almost whole again.